So first session today is transforming city economies. I'm just going to start by introducing our panel today. So we've got Rachel down the end from the Centre for Thriving Places. Rachel specialises in supporting people in places to work out how to start taking a different approach to how decisions are made, resources are spent, programmes are designed, and different parts of the system can be linked up, with a particular focus on well-being in local places. We've got Hani Salih from the Quality of Life Foundation. Hani co-leads the implementation of resident review services and facilitates research initiatives across a host of sectors using their Quality of Life framework. We've also got Ben Beach from Unit 38. Ben's an architectural designer, urbanist and researcher. He's part of an architect practice that specialises in pioneering new models of urban development and has been involved in the award-winning Ward's Corner community plan in London. And then finally, standing in for a change in the programme today from Maddie from Bristol Commons, we've got Balla. Danny's a creative facilitator, social permaculture educator and activist dedicated to create systemic change. He began working for Coexist, a Bristol organisation, in 2011, became a co-director in 2017, and as part of Coexist launched the Bristol Commons in 2023. So just a little bit of a setup. As you know, over the last decade and more, of course, our cities have changed in some ways beyond recognition, with both the inexorable rise of private capital coming into urban regeneration and with the withdrawal of state funding from publicly owned assets, services, and local development. Despite the negative mood about the economy, in some ways it's quite easy to also underestimate the scale and intensification of private ownership over the last decade. There was a recent report by the think tank IPPR that estimates that local councils have sold off in the region of £15 billion of assets since 2010 when the coalition took power. And this is the most important and probably most depressing bit of that data. Just over 3% of those assets have gone into community ownership, so 97% into private. Now 1 in 5 council leaders are expecting to declare bankruptcy in the next 15 months alone. So city economies have a lot to tell us in a kind of really direct and visceral way about the kind of current purpose and shape of the economy. It's there in the built environment, it's there in the ownership of the businesses we see, the presence or the lack of social infrastructure, the exclusivity of new housing development, and of course the availability of green space. So I think this conversation is going to start at least from kind of how UK city economies have changed, probably for the worst, but then we're going to move more positively into the kind of the policy tools, the ownership models and the partnerships that we're seeing across the public, third and private sectors that kind of present an opportunity to reverse this trend. So let's get the conversation going. Question for the whole panel, and I'll start with Ben because you're on my left. But yeah, within your work, within your experience, how has city economies kind of changed in the last decade?
Good morning. Thank you all for coming to see us. How have economies changed? For the worse, I would say. I really don't think anyone would look at the state of our cities and say this is fine. It clearly isn't. And I think to try and understand what's happening, I've done quite a bit of research trying to understand the origins of a lot of urban policies that we have in the UK. So my background's in architecture, and consequently a lot of my sort of interest in urban economies is more about the use of our land, the use of our assets, our housing, and what it means when we develop our cities and how that's happened. What I found quite interesting was to look at the roots of what is currently the sort of orthodoxy of urban regeneration in London. The UK as a whole now, it really, how can we bring the private sector at any cost? How can we leverage state assets? How can we leverage public sector money to ensure that the private sector makes as much money as possible from what is essentially our urban assets? And the roots of this are actually far more pernicious than you think at first glance. On the one hand, this sort of looks like this is sort of classic neoliberalism, the sort of origins of many of our problems in the economy. But actually, a lot of it also comes back down to really theories of social control. And it really traces back to Thatcher's government in 1979. And this was the focus of quite a big piece of research I did at university. When the Conservatives came to power in 1979, they didn't really have any urban policy. The idea of urban policy as a whole wasn't something that they really thought about. The only thing that really did sort of pass for urban policy was the privatisation of social housing. And they saw this very clearly as a way of breaking down the organised left, breaking down working class communities who would vote for Labour. And they saw property-only democracy, of course, as a way of sort of locking in the interests of a section of the working class, or those of finance, and those of the sort of landowners who continue to own most of the economy. But this isn't really urban policy. What develops urban policy, and where the roots of our sort of contemporary urban regeneration strategies lie, actually is in the response to the 1981 uprisings that we saw in Liverpool, in Toxteth, in Brixton, in various parts of London, in Bristol, in St Paul's. And it's Michael Heseltine that writes a paper called It Took a Riot. He said it took a riot for us to realise the dangers posed by these urban areas. The answer really is property-led regeneration. And this is the beginning of a whole raft of urban policies that we see sort of accelerate time and time again every time the state is encountering mass rioting. And these are focused on bringing in the private sector, on making urban assets as favourable as possible to financial institutions, to the point where Heseltine sets up a financial institutions group where he seconds the director of some of the biggest banks in the UK to directly design government policy with the interests of finance at its heart. And if we look at the sort of legacy of these policies, this is now how we approach regeneration today, the sort of pamphlet set of tools and techniques about leveraging in investment. And this is fundamentally undemocratic. They're very explicit about this. They call this forcibly injecting entrepreneurialism into local authorities. And the way a lot of this is done is through sort of territorial suspension of democracy, the usurpation of planning powers back to Downing Street. And there are also huge rounds of measures that really are designed to clip public participation out of urban development processes. And this is really, I think, the roots of where we've arrived at today, which, of course, is the housing crisis, is the inaffordability of city centres, is a sort of development that tramples over local needs, and the sort of ultimately the exclusion of the working class from city centres. So I don't think it's changing for the better, but I'm sure we'll come on some of the solutions.
Cool. Thank you, Ben, for a bit of the history around urban policy. I'll just go down to Rachel on the end.
Is that on? Yeah. It's super interesting, I think, hearing the history, and I think it's really important to understand that. Thank you for that rundown. Because a lot of the work that we do at the Centre for Thriving Places is looking at, ultimately it's looking at how can you create places that support the conditions for people to thrive in an equitable and sustainable way. So you're looking at the outcome, what does good look like? But really what we're looking at is how do you make that happen? And if you're trying to, and currently the current system doesn't make that happen. So to understand why the current system, why the way that places and cities are set up doesn't really create the conditions for people to thrive, I think that's really relevant to this question of why. Why do we design places that don't make us thrive? And if you ask it in that way, you sort of think, why on earth would you design housing that makes people unhealthy? Why on earth would we design cities? Why are we doing that? What I've seen in the last 10 years, and I suppose maybe I agree that it's quite bad. I think there's a big paradigm shift happening, which I feel quite hopeful about. I've spent quite a lot of time in the last few years working with, and then also in local government. I was head of local economic development for a little while at Barking and Dagenham, which is one of the councils in London that has kind of taken the bull by its horns a bit over the last 5 years and set up its own council-owned development company and actually built stuff, which is quite interesting. Some really brilliant stuff, some stuff that has been, was harder to do and does result in the council then acting more like a private developer. So that's quite an interesting kind of experience. But I think what's happening at the moment is that there is a bigger shift in the paradigm within mainstream, people who are doing mainstream economic development, where the penny has dropped a bit, that cities really are not generating the conditions for people to thrive. But what we're seeing is a massive lag in time between people saying, okay, we all get this now. Maybe 15 years ago, we were still arguing that it was a good idea to get private finance to invest in assets. Now there's more understanding, I think, a bit more understanding within mainstream circles that maybe that isn't generating the things we need. But the problem is that a lot of the fact that it's been going on for the last 30 years, as Ben says, is it's locked a lot of the structures into place, and it will take another 30 or 40 years to undo that. So I think that the thing that's changed in the last 10 years, maybe for the better, is that I think people are waking up a bit to why it doesn't work and what better would look like. But there's a challenge about how you then unpick those systems.
Yeah, I think it's really important to talk about how entrenched it is. Hani, can I bring you in?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are really good ways to sort of contextualize the moment we're in. I think that there is the situation, I think, with as you've said, it's sort of a long series of events that have kind of created the context that we're in. But I think what to kind of echo what you're saying is that there is an undercurrent of people who are trying to change that or either operate outside of the kind of the accepted or current delivery methods for regeneration and housing. And I think it's really for us is sort of so with the work I do at the Quality of Life Foundation is. We are trying to advocate for a slightly different way of thinking about what we prioritize when we think about housing, neighborhoods and communities, be it through sort of delivery of new housing stock or sort of regeneration. And that sort of shift in priorities that we're trying to instigate is really off the back of, as you said, there's a shift in what is important, and I think the pandemic has been one of the reasons why health and well-being is probably really become a priority for a lot of development, regeneration, and any kind of investment in any kind of social or local infrastructure. And for us, that is combined with this idea of long-termism. When you're thinking about building or when you're thinking about regeneration, how can you make that a long-term project? How can you make that a prospect? And with that comes questions of stewardship, community ownership, and alternative ways of delivering infrastructure and housing. And that's where you really start to be able to bring the kind of the efforts that have been happening on the sort of in the undercurrent into the mainstream. And I think there is now increasingly more appetite. You mentioned the example of Be First at Barking Dagenham. That's a really good example, I think. And you also start to see a lot more interest of people going to the public sector. So there's programs like Public Practice, which has just gone national, which is a really interesting way of taking some of that talent that would have been usually sort of locked up in the private sector and really bringing that into public sector work. So there's different ways of investigating sort of ways of bucking the trend, I could say. I could talk a bit more about the work that we do and our perspective on that later, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And then, Danny, you've got quite a specific experience here in Bristol and Stokes Croft that you might want to talk about.
Okay, yeah, sure. I think that, whilst it is really important to consider the macro and the reasons why we've seen such change and intensification of hardship in the economy over the last 10 years. It's also really important to think about the lived experience of people. So, we've seen this increase in precarity and how difficult it is to feel safe in a job, feel safe that you'll earn enough money to kind of make the rent, to secure housing, to even envision a positive future. And we kind of see the roots of this going much, much further back than just Thatcher. In fact, as part of the Bristol Commons, we've been exploring, those very first enclosures, that separation from people from the land and the privatisation of land, that those enclosures have continued, throughout the centuries and have only intensified under neoliberalism. And the last 10 years have seen that kind of extraction and that co-option and that privatisation continue, and that's had quite a profound effect. And just to sort of name what you were speaking about, Jonny, Coexist founded a project called Hamilton House in Stokes Croft in Bristol, which was an empty building, quite a big one, 55,000 square feet, and it became the largest cultural community centre that was grassroots in the UK. And the economy that was generated from that and the ecosystem that surrounded it, all of those artists, those social enterprises, those charities, the people that will come and use that space, not just for their place of work, but also for their social needs as well, really kind of was a model for that kind of change. And we've seen, with this intensification, the kind of co-option of spaces like that. It's not easy to kind of run a community project unless you come back to that ownership. And so I think that when we think about how things have changed for the economy, we do need to think about who owns the assets and how are RTTs being used. They're essentially being used as sites of extraction. It's the control of assets which fundamentally are causing so much of the pain for people and their lived experience. That's something that the Bristol Commons and many other organisations are seeking to change, and maybe we can come more to some of those solutions in a minute.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, everybody. So I kind of want to turn now to kind of, as you've just kind of alluded to, a bit more of the kind of the positive interventions that we've started to see that the pandemic is part of that, but obviously predates the pandemic. Maybe kind of mobilise more and encourage more by it. But I wanted to look at ownership, of course, as Danny suggested, policy tools and different partnerships between public, third and private sectors. But starting with policy, does anybody want to respond on the panel about kind of policy tools that you've seen at the local level, at the national level, within local government, and in that kind of area that you think, are kind of enhancing the ability of communities to, take and own more space in city economies?
There's lots of other people who have a lot more expertise on this than me, and I suspect many of you are in this audience. But I think, so obviously there are, starting with a local government perspective, which I think is quite interesting, I've seen a massive variation in how willing councils are to use the powers that already exist. So there are powers that already exist to do a compulsory purchase order on properties, to use planning powers in a way that ends up affecting who owns things, to pass community assets onto communities. But I think there is a massive variation across the country in how councils are using that power. And some of that is to do with political will, but some of it, I think, is to do with a shift, the mindset that exists within a given council about whether the job of that council is to intervene in the market or not. And I think that's shifted a lot. I feel quite hopeful. I feel like I've been kind of working in that space with councils for about 15 years, and I think there's been a massive shift in the degree to which councils or more councils feel like it is their job to directly shape the market and to try and figure out how they can change, what the ownership patterns are in their city. Just thinking of things I'm aware of right now, I think there's there are some really good examples of councils kind of taking a more strategic approach to converting physical assets that they either already owned and hadn't yet sold off, or proactively had bought, and making it possible for community or non-profit organisations to run those spaces. What I would say, though, and I know we're supposed to be in the hopeful section now, so I'm not going to buck that by saying, I think there's a massive challenge, just as there's this nascent movement over the last 5 or 6 years of councils saying, actually this is possible to do. You've got some examples like Be First in Barking and Dagenham of sort of doing that. Then you have this implosion that's been boiling up for the last 15 years of council finances, and we've seen it in the number of councils now going bankrupt. You see what's happening in Birmingham. You've got Birmingham City Council, who actually have done quite a lot of progressive things. There is quite a lot of political will. They are one of the councils that I would say has been up for being quite interventionist, who are now in a position where they feel like they have to do a fire sale of the last remaining assets they do own. There's some amazing community organising happening in Birmingham. There's a Save Birmingham campaign. I don't know if anybody from there is here now. So there is interesting stuff happening, but it can feel quite frustrating, I think, just as we were getting to the point where it felt like, okay, we've got a few models, some people, it's 15 years ago when I started doing this work, the question was always, yes, but what evidence is there? What evidence is there if the council puts this money in, will it make people's lives better? And it was very difficult to say yes, because we've been doing it for the last 30 years, because we hadn't been doing it for the last 30 years. Now there is some evidence. There are some really interesting, good bits of work that have been done to say, yep, actually, if you do this thing, then 10 years later, quality of life does go up in your community. So just where we're at this tipping point. So I think that's a bit of a challenge we'll have to look at in the next few years. Sorry, I'll stop there a bit.
I'd like to follow that just because being part of an organisation that essentially was trying to own a building that we kind of started and kind of built up and not receive that support from the council is quite an interesting position to be in. Like you were talking about the compulsory purchase orders, this is a really interesting thing, and maybe with this kind of change of government, we'll see more kind of right to buy rather than just a right to bid. So that's a really great example of a policy change that could happen. That would really empower communities. The Community Ownership Fund, obviously, is a really great example of a tool and a fund that can be used, not necessarily a policy. The policy, I think, has been kind of quite thin, certainly at local level within Bristol and at a national level. But you're seeing organisations fill the void and campaign and advocate for this change. So the We're Here Now campaign, it's been a really kind of great example of helping create that shift. And I think, before you were speaking about how there is this kind of like optimism and you're seeing, groups and this kind of change start to happen, that Overton window of what's possible is definitely moving. And I think that what we need to do is we need to have more collaboration. We need to have a greater practical application of reciprocity and what it means to support each other's organisations and campaigns in order to kind of further this shift. And I think that's something that really sits at the heart of commoning, because it's also about relationships. It's not just about ownership. There is no commons unless there is relationship around, the entirety of the commons, that be that kind of knowledge, be that kind of land-based assets, be that kind of relational assets. And I think that one of the incredible things that we have is a kind of thirst and a sort of a desire to upskill and to kind of be more dynamic than we are, because this stasis, I think, is what's fueling a lot of people and a lot of organisations to kind of like burst up and try to change things.
Yeah, I mean, if I could also just jump in on that, I think one of the things that for me it feels that it's been really helpful in sort of instigating this change is that there seems to be more tools and more sort of building the language to be able to articulate how do these things actually happen? How does a community how is a community able to build the infrastructure to be able to actually manage assets and be able to even speak the language of sort of legislative or policy speak and planning speak? And I think some of the work that I do with the foundation is to try and do this kind of work of translating across value systems, and that we work with a variety of sort of stakeholders, from local authorities to sort of central planning teams, national planning teams, and also with housing associations and private housing developers as well. So we really have to try to understand what are the incentives for developers in this instance to listen to a community or to consider the health and well-being of a community particularly. And I mean, it's quite cynical, but sometimes you just have to say, well, this is going to improve your profits down the line. But really the reality of it is that actually them investing in that, and that's something also we've found, is that there's a surprising amount of private sector developers, not all of them, but quite a surprising number of them, are actually open to considering more deeply what does it mean for them to deliver a healthy and happy community and neighbourhood, whether that's because they want to build their sort of portfolio, or whether they have a sort of a mandate by the fact that maybe they are like owned by sort of an investment a pension fund or something like that, But I think what's been really helpful, in my perspective, is over the last sort of 10 to 15 years, people have started to look around rather than through sort of current planning policy systems and mechanisms for delivery, and try to understand, okay, what else can we do? How can we mobilize the social or the economic capital to be able to own a building, or to be able to kind of influence the ways in which what gets prioritized. Look at the number of neighborhood plans that are sort of being put forward now. It's still quite a difficult process. You need to have someone who knows what they're doing in that sense, but it's still a tool that's becoming kind of more common. And so I think that's a big part of it, is that there's this kind of, it speaks to this idea of people are speaking across different value systems, but also using tools and building the vocabulary to be able to sort of democratize that process too.
Yeah, I'm actually quite optimistic as well, despite my "it's all fucked" thing. No, I think a lot is changing. I really would agree that I think a bit of a paradigm shift is underway, and I think no small part of that really is I think there's much greater awareness of what the implications of our urban economies are. 10, 15 years ago, huge programs of estate clearances were happening across London. The Aylesbury estate was a real turning point, I think, in that, where you were seeing thousands and thousands of people being very violently dispossessed from their homes. And eventually there's a huge amount of resistance to that. And I think that has actually softened some of the sharpest edges of urban regeneration schemes. It's forcing even the sort of most capitalist of capitalists to sort of sit and really think about what the social ramifications of their schemes are. And that's at the hard edge. And I think actually across the more social and soft edges of that, we're seeing a huge range of new techniques and tools being developed. And moreover, we're getting real evidence bases in, actually, to show that this stuff works. Like if we look at the successes in community planning up in Preston and the Preston model and the impacts that's had on local economic development, we're really seeing that when we bed this in quite holistically and think about our economies in the round, we see real material improvements in quality of life, in employment outcomes, in local economic fortunes. And I think a lot is being built on that now as well. I think part of the things sort of undergirded this neoliberal approach to urbanism was this privatisation of state assets. And there's a much greater awareness now, I think, of the impact of privatising these assets, and a lot more people willing to contest them. And we're seeing that, especially with the community groups we're working with, many of whom are trying to sort of halt privatisations of council land or council estates, or bring assets under community control. And I think if the watchwords of neoliberalism was a public-private partnership, where really it's just we allow them to monetize our assets, something that we're trying to sort of explore with Abundance, this organisation, sort of a community wealth building organisation I'm involved with, is the idea of the public commons partnership. Like, what would it mean for the state to proactively work with organised community groups to develop assets owned by the state, held in common or by the state, for the benefit of local people as part of wider and more holistic community wealth building strategies. And an example of this is the Wall's Corner Community Plan, which I'm sure will come up a bit later in conversation. But this is an example where a Latin American community had a market that was incredibly important to their cultural and social economic life. That had been built up over generations by migrants coming to the city. This was inland, owned by Transport for London, and it was going to be given over to a private developer to build over 190 luxury flats. And actually, after a 20-year campaign by the traders, they sort of got the Mayor of London and Transport for London to acknowledge the benefits of a public commons partnership approach, and are now working in partnership to develop that site so it can be used in perpetuity for community benefit. And so actually we are seeing that even in these seemingly intractable situations, actually like a lot of those frictions are starting to give way into much more positive approaches to development. I think that is really encouraging.
Yeah, sorry, and I think it's also really cumulative. I think once local authorities and stakeholders see other places that have done it, it gives them a template to do it. I think that's kind of what I was trying to also insinuate, in that I think there is a sea change because people are seeing things like that happen, and also there's no. I think it's worth also highlighting that these movements they do build solidarity. So these organisations will speak to other organisations to sort of articulate how they manage to navigate the system, as it were. So yeah.
Cool. Thank you, everybody. We're going to move to questions from the floor. Kelly, have you got a roving mic? Yeah, we've got a mic at the back. Oh, we're going to take one of these mics. Yeah, perfect. Brilliant. We kind of touched on ownership a bit. I wonder if there's any questions on the floor around ownership, given that, public ownership is obviously, under attack, and with local government bankruptcies, obviously those assets are being threatened. Are public common partnerships an answer to that in some way? Is there more protection there in those ownership models than just kind of pure exclusive state ownership, local state ownership, for instance? But any hands from the floor? We'll come and find you. Take a question at a time.
Hi, John from Mainly Unlimited in Newport, South Wales. Nobody mentioned community asset transfers in the introduction. We've done a couple successfully, and I've been involved in one unsuccessfully in Newport. There are challenges around that. We're a small third sector organisation, and you need quite a lot of skill to manage a building. But it's been a successful model. We've got a library and a public toilet block that's been converted, and they're good models. It was fairly straightforward, and there's a policy wrap around that.
Cool, thank you. Rhiannon?
I guess my question is coming to the fact that we've obviously just had a Labour government elected. I'm sure everyone has mixed feelings about, what this government is and what they can do, and also talking about being in Bristol, having a Green MP elected, also a Green Council. I don't know the details of what potential plans Labour has around policy or reinvestment in council or all of these things, but I'd be really interested to hear what your thoughts are, like hope or not hope is, with obviously the shift in government we're seeing, what is the potential there, and maybe also what are the challenges as well.
Cool, great. So, community asset transfers, obviously something that became popular with the coalition government, and at least the right to bid. Danny mentioned the kind of right to buy. Maybe that might be a new policy kind of tweak that may be more material, be more beneficial than what we've seen in the last decade. And in my introduction, I talked about, in terms of the £15 billion worth of assets that have been transferred from the state, only 3%. And obviously community asset transfers are part of that story. But starting with community asset transfers?
I can speak to it briefly. I think that it has lots of implications to community asset transfer, because you have all of a sudden the responsibility of looking after a building which might be in a state of kind of great disrepair. And if you've got a short-term community asset transfer, it can be quite difficult to raise finance. So you're kind of often sort of quite shackled, really, by community asset transfers. And in Bristol, we've seen a legacy of very kind of like short-term thinking with community asset transfers and a reluctance to actually grant them. I'd say that's changed very recently. There is one kind of like pretty major exception in that Black South West Network have just received a 125-year community asset transfer for their coach house just off Stokes Croft, which is really fantastic. And I think that gives community organisations an opportunity to do something really different. So I think it's really about how you use those asset transfers. They're a useful tool when used well. And I think sometimes it's about earning trust, which, is fair enough. You give a short-term asset transfer, but there needs to be the kind of the conditions in the wider ecosystem to be able to support the work that needs to be done, in those spaces. So it's useless having a community asset transfer if you've got like a flatlining economy, no way to raise finance, and, essentially a very kind of precarious situation for the community organisation. That's not going to help anybody. I'd like to see sort of wider support for community organisations, and that statistic that you gave, I knew that it was high before, about 97% kind of being sold off to organisations and companies that are not community focused. That's terrifying, and something that we felt, and what we really need to do is make sure that value, that kind of that essentially those assets are something that we can use to catalyse this change rather than just a short-term injection of capital.
Cool, thank you. If you're standing at the back, we've got more chairs at the front if you do want to sit down. But just picking up quickly on the election, any kind of quick round on what you think may happen?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I have a couple of thoughts on that. I think, just to be really quick, I think there's a difference between national policy suggestions that I've seen coming out of Labour and what's coming out from local Labour politicians. I'm choosing my words carefully here because we're a charity. I think it's very interesting that 8 out of the 9 Metro mayors are Labour now. And to the extent that combined authorities are quite a young kind of form of governance, but I think there is some really interesting stuff coming through that is being led at combined and local authority level. And I think there are some quite interesting things that are coming out of Labour councils that I'm aware of in regards to thinking about who owns what is state-owned, how the state works with the community sector. I am really hoping that in the next few years what we see is a better understanding at national level of what that can do. I feel like that's not quite there yet. And I think there's a gap between the national policy stuff that's being talked about and what's possible local. And the thing that I'm worried about, that I want to look out for, is if anybody read the Powering Up Britain pamphlet that Labour put out with their manifesto, there's quite a lot in there about how councils should be funded again to do the job that they do best, the implication being that is service provision, which is great, definitely need more money back for that, but I'm worried that that reveals a sense that the local government's job is not really to run the economy and that we're still leaving that to private sector interests. Whereas I think at local level there's much more social entrepreneurialism that could be possible from council. So I think that's the thing I'd watch out for.
If I could also come in on the election point, I will also have to very carefully choose my words. Just a point for more broadly thinking about what the work that we do at the Quality of Life Foundation is to try to sort of re-articulate what the idea of health and well-being and home is. So we think it's not just about, and sort of our sort of problem statement is there's too much short-termism. We're thinking about just building, before it was 300,000 units homes a year, which is anyway. And I think I've read very briefly that Labour might sort of reintroduce housing targets, and for us the issue isn't necessarily the number of, the issue is the number kind of, but it's also the quality of those homes. So what we want to make sure is becomes very clear is actually we need to build better quality homes that better facilitate health and well-being outcomes for neighbourhoods people, both new and existing, and that also has an economic element to it too. And actually, like, you can't expect an unhealthy neighbourhood to have positive net economic output, and that should not be the only measure for a successful neighbourhood either. So just wanted to sort of speak to that point and just say that it's important that we don't lose focus and we don't go back to thinking about quantity. We also need to think very deeply about quality. And that comes also with the asterisk that we're in a climate crisis. We should not just be building a buttload of homes. We should actually be reinvesting in sort of doing a lot of retrofit. That's right.
Cool. Thank you, Hani. We've got a few minutes left, so I'm just going to bring Ben and Danny in for last comment on that question.
It's quite a good one to follow up on, actually. There's obviously a lot to say about Starmer's Labour, and I don't have to pick my words very carefully, so I'm not a fan. But I think on the one hand, like, they're aware that a lot of councils are going to go bankrupt, and they're probably not going to let that happen. And like, even if that steadies the ship, I think that creates a lot more room for manoeuvre in terms of the more progressive policies that can happen at the local level. And I do agree there's a lot of exciting stuff happening. And with the Green MPs, the strength of independence, actually there is a sort of case where their feet are going to be in the fire a bit, and actually, like, we might see our room for manoeuvre expand. But on the flip side, always watch the stock market and see whose ticker's going up, and it's the volume house builders that are, like, doing well out of this election. If you've been watching Labour's housing policy, you'll have seen that the Yes in My Backyard crowd, which is a term, YIMBY, was created by a PR agency for developers. These people have been all over Labour. They were all over the last conference. And like, if you just follow the money, you can see all the lobbyists have been moving from the Conservatives over to Labour. And within 3 days of winning the election, the first thing they've announced is planning reform. Like, we don't have a planning policy in this country. The national planning policy was reduced from 1,500 pages under David Cameron to 50 by the time it finished on austerity. There's no regional planning in place outside of London. Like, the planning system is not the reason that we're not building sufficient housing in this country. It is not the cause of the problems in development in this country. The problem is the financialisation of land and the fact that we've given over all development rights essentially to the private sector. And of course, they are building for profit and not in the interest of people. So the fact that the first thing we're going to do is tear up what's left of the planning system is not going to fix that. And the people advocating for that are the people who are causing the problem. So it's going to be sort of pushed in one direction. And I think the task for all of us really is to push it back the other way and stop this happening. So it's clear the direction of travel, I think, and that should be a cause of concern.
I'm not massively optimistic with this new government, but I do experience a kind of like easing of the nervous system. And I think that's probably quite a good indicator. There's more opportunity, I think, to have voices heard, and I think that's very, very important. But I think what I would really like to see is justice to be kind of placed at the heart of decision-making and much more kind of like systems thinking. So any project, whether it is a big housing development, needs to ask, well, how is this kind of redressing the balance here and making sure that we're empowering those that have been marginalised? And so, you could point to things like quotas for affordable housing. You can also look at the kind of impact on climate and what we're doing to kind of contribute towards, restoration of our ecosystems and changing the way that we kind of live in our cities to make it something which is actually a positive experience, not just for humans, but for other species as well. And I think that we need to have that systemic thinking at the heart of change, a real focus on supporting those that have been most marginalised, and it's been pretty brutal under the Tory government over the last 14 years, and to make sure that we have this kind of like dedication to calling out the decisions and challenging the decisions that may come in on this top-down massive majority that jeopardise that, and to really kind of be there ready with alternative and perhaps more radical, but definitely more progressive and more just solutions.
Cool. What a great place to leave it. This conversation can, of course, continue after this session, but we're going to get reset for the next session. Thank you to Ben, thank you to Hani, thank you to Danny, and, of course, to Rachel. Thanks for joining us.